The ship looked like a mistake. Archivist Surveyor Kel Wren thought that before the tractor beams had even finished dragging it into docking cradle 12, and he kept thinking it as the docking clamps locked down around the hull with a heavy metallic groan. The vessel was long in the awkward way of something designed by committee and then built by stubborn laborers who had decided they were done arguing. The plating was patchwork iron alloy, matte and ugly, with visible weld seams raised like scar tissue. There were letters painted directly onto the side in thick white blocks, not projected, not etched, not embossed with any proper registration finish. Just painted. The CV Wayfarer. Kel stared at the name for a long moment and felt an almost scholarly kind of embarrassment on behalf of the species that had made it. The translation matrix gave him a dozen possible renderings for the ship's class marker and none of them helped. Civilian vessel. Settler craft. Colonial transport. Nothing improved the basic fact that the thing looked primitive. Not romantically primitive. Not early elegant. Just unfinished. The engine housings were enormous relative to the hull mass, which made sense once the intake scans returned and confirmed the absurdity. Chemical propulsion. Real combustion architecture. Reaction mass tanks. The sort of thing Kel had only ever seen in museum sims and Foundation-era technical archives from before his people had learned better. He ran the transit estimate twice, then a third time because the first two answers insulted him. At rated burn, the human vessel would have needed nearly 9 years to reach its stated colony destination. 9 years. Kel looked through the glass wall of the survey gallery at the ship sitting inert in the cradle and tried to imagine boarding a metal tube and stepping back out of it almost a decade later with the expectation of building a new life. The concept had a kind of vulgar courage to it, he supposed, but courage was often just another word people used when intelligence had failed to intervene. He entered the first line of his assessment. Initial impression: technologically immature, materially crude, low-threat colonial architecture. That looked right. By the time he reached the holding level, the humans had already been processed into containment groups. Standard procedure. Environmental compatibility confirmed. Nutritional pathways adjusted. Medical screening complete. No severe injuries from boarding. One human had fractured a patrol officer's wrist using nothing but leverage and a cargo restraint strap, which had earned a brief security notation and very little concern. Species under stress fought irrationally all the time. It did not usually mean anything. Kel moved past holding rooms 1 and 2 with only a glance inside. The adults were where you would expect them to be after forced detention. Sitting in family clusters. Speaking in low voices. Performing reassurance for one another. A few stared at the overhead cameras with open anger, but anger was common and therefore uninteresting. What mattered was pattern, and at first the pattern looked ordinary. Then he stopped at holding room 3. The room housed 31 juveniles and 6 adults, most of the adults seated along the wall while the children occupied the center floor. Kel frowned and adjusted the audio pickup. The children were playing. That, by itself, was not noteworthy. Juveniles across many species played under stress. Play was compression, a way for young minds to push fear into forms they could move around. But this game was odd. A small human with dark hair stood at the far wall with both hands over her eyes, counting aloud in a steady rhythm. 3 other children scattered. 2 ran toward the storage alcove near the sanitation recess. The third moved more slowly, deliberately crossing open space where the seeker would be most likely to spot movement first. Kel leaned closer to the glass. The obvious decoy was not the interesting part. The interesting part was what the other 2 had done before they split. A touch to the wrist. 2 fingers at the shoulder. A flat palm turned downward. Signals. Tiny, fast practice. The child at the wall finished counting and turned. She found the decoy almost immediately, exactly as expected. The room burst into noise. Pointing. Laughing. False complaint. And in the middle of that sound, one of the hidden children changed position cleanly, using the brief attention spike as cover to cross behind a larger adult and vanish into a new angle beside the food dispensers. Kel watched 6 rounds. In all 6, the seeker identified someone. In none of the rounds did the seeker identify everyone. By round 4 they were rotating roles with visible intent. The child who had hidden successfully last time became the seeker the next round. The decoy became the signaler. They were not merely playing. They were teaching each other how line of sight worked, how distraction worked, how movement disappeared inside motion. He entered a note. Observed juvenile stress game. Cooperative displacement behavior. Possible adaptive social bonding exercise. He looked at the sentence and felt dissatisfied with it. Across the room, one of the seated adults lifted her head. She was human female by the manifest, 36 standard years, colonial systems planner, assigned name Mara Ilian. Until that moment she had appeared to be resting. Now she was looking directly at the observation wall. Not vaguely toward it. At the exact panel behind which Kel stood. The one-way glass was functioning. Diagnostics had confirmed that before the first detainee was moved inside. She could not see him. There was no angle from the room that would reveal the gallery beyond. And yet she fixed on the precise point where his face would have been visible if the wall had been transparent. Kel held still. So did she. 1 second. 3. 9. She did not blink first. Kel stepped back from the glass and only afterward realized his pulse had changed. He returned to his console in the corridor and added one more line beneath the juvenile observation. Adult subject in room 3 demonstrates unusual environmental awareness. Continued monitoring recommended. He saved the log, closed the file, and told himself he had merely found the first interesting detail in an otherwise embarrassing ship full of frightened primitives. It was a good explanation. It just did not survive contact with the feeling that stayed with him all the way back to his quarters, the small unpleasant sense that the humans inside holding room 3 had begun doing something the moment the doors shut, and that he was already later to it than he should have been. Kel Ren spent the next 3 days trying to convince himself that the unease was professional. That was the respectable explanation. He was a surveyor archivist attached to the Contact and Containment Bureau, and his entire discipline was built on noticing the small things before they grew teeth. Unusual gestures. Repeated glances. Changes in group cohesion under stress. If the humans in holding room 3 were producing a low-grade sense of wrongness in him, then that only meant his training was working as designed. It did not explain why he kept returning to the observation wall long after his assigned review periods were over. On the second day, he watched the children again. The game had changed. Or rather, the shape of it was the same while the internal logic shifted. A child still counted. Others still hid. Noise still bloomed around each discovery. But the signals were smaller now, more compressed, less visible to anyone not looking for them. A knuckle touched against a thigh. 2 blinks. A tilt of the chin so slight the room cameras only caught it if he slowed the feed to quarter speed. They were not getting calmer. They were getting more efficient. He ran a behavior overlay against the previous day's recording and found the average movement time between signal and position change had dropped by almost 18%. He stared at the number for a long moment. Children under detention stress should have been stabilizing or deteriorating, not optimizing. He nearly entered that into the formal log. Nearly. Then he imagined how it would read on review. Juvenile detainees exhibit increasing efficiency in cooperative hiding game. He could already hear Senior Examiner Toval asking whether Kel had seriously interrupted the Bureau's schedule because human children were getting better at play. So he filed it nowhere and watched another 7 rounds instead. On round 8, one of the smaller boys let himself be found immediately, loudly enough to pull the seeker and 2 of the adults toward the storage alcove. While they were looking, a girl on the opposite side of the room slipped beneath a bench support, removed a nutrition tray from where it had been stacked, and examined the fastening mechanism underneath with both hands before replacing it exactly as it had been. Kel leaned so close to the glass that his breath briefly fogged the inside surface of the gallery. It lasted less than 4 seconds. When the room settled, she was laughing with the others as if nothing had happened. He replayed it 6 times before going back to his desk. On the 3rd day, he requested interview clearance on a procedural pretext and spent 40 minutes in holding room 1 speaking with a human propulsion technician named Tomas Vale. Tomas was polite in the careful way of someone who had already decided anger would be wasted on the current phase of the situation. He answered questions about the Wayfarer's engines, colony fuel calculations, life support margins, and route planning with patient detail. He did not challenge the detention, did not plead, did not posture, just explained things in a flat, practical voice while his hands rested loosely on the table. Kel almost left the interview thinking his first impression had been correct after all. Then Tomas asked, just between one answer and the next, "How many personnel maintain the station's civilian dock wing?" Kel did not respond at once. The human nodded as if that silence itself had supplied useful information and immediately went back to discussing combustion balance ratios in a way that made the question sound incidental in hindsight. It was not incidental. Kel knew that the moment the interview ended. He checked the transcript afterward. Tomas had embedded 4 such questions across the conversation, spaced widely enough that none of them seemed linked unless read together afterward. How many personnel maintain this dock wing? Whether the artificial day cycle on the station matched the homeworld standard. How often environmental filters were serviced manually instead of automatically. Whether survey staff rotated by section or by detainee population. They were not random curiosities. They were structural questions. Kel saved the transcript under its proper case number, then copied it into a private local file he did not assign to any official directory. He had never done that before in his bureau career. The act itself made him sit still for a moment afterward, fingers resting on the console as if they belonged to someone else. He told himself it was only comparative diligence. The explanation felt thin even while he used it. That evening he reviewed visual scans from holding room 2 and found another small wrongness. One of the older human males, broad-shouldered and gray at the temples, had spent 36 minutes walking the perimeter of the room in what first appeared to be a stress pattern. He paused every few meters, stretched once, leaned against the wall twice, stopped to speak to 2 different detainees near the sanitation unit and once near the water station. On normal speed it was aimless. On slowed replay it wasn't. His pauses formed intervals, measured ones, not equal, exactly, but consistent relative to the room geometry. He was not pacing because he was agitated. He was pacing because he was counting something he could not yet write down. Kel enhanced the feed and followed the man's gaze path. Ceiling vent, camera housing, door seam, floor drain, nutrition slot, light fixture, return to door seam, repeat, a map without ink. He sat back from the display with the same feeling he had gotten when Mara Ilian looked through the one-way wall and held the place where his face should have been. Not fear. Not yet. Something more humiliating. The first faint awareness that he might be the one inside the observation chamber without realizing it. He went to holding room 3 again before rest cycle. Mara Ilian was seated against the wall in the same place as before, hands folded loosely over one knee, eyes half-lidded in what might have passed for fatigue if Kel had not been looking more carefully now. Across the room, the children were playing their game again, except now 2 of the adults were involved. Not openly, not enough for a procedural violation, but enough to shape traffic. One shifted position at exactly the right moment to block the seeker's view. Another laughed too loudly, drawing attention left while the real movement happened right. Mara did not join in. She simply watched. After a while she raised her head and looked at the observation wall again, finding the same point with impossible precision. This time Kel did not move away. He stood where he was and let the seconds build. 1, 2, 4, 7. Then, very slowly, Mara lifted one hand and adjusted a strand of hair behind her ear. A meaningless gesture, except that across the room one of the children immediately switched direction in the middle of a run and vanished cleanly behind the sanitation partition before the seeker turned. Kel felt the back of his neck go cold. He returned to his quarters after shift and opened the private file again. He stared at the blank field for almost a minute before typing the first sentence. The humans are not becoming organized under detention stress. They arrived organized and are using detention as an environment to be studied. He read it twice. Then he added a second line beneath it. I do not yet know what they believe they are preparing for. That ignorance may itself be the first problem. On the 4th day, Kel Ren requested access to the maintenance sweeps for holding rooms 1 through 3 and justified it under behavioral environment correlation analysis. No one questioned the request. Why would they? He was a bureau archivist with a clean record, and the station's command staff considered the Wayfarer detainees an annoyance measured in paperwork rather than danger. If Kel wanted to compare room usage against cleaning intervals and circulation patterns, that only confirmed the official view that this was all being handled at the proper, civilized level of detail. The maintenance feeds were low resolution, fixed angle, and mostly useless. Which turned out to be exactly why they mattered. The humans behaved differently under them. In the high-grade observation rooms they sat, talked, played, slept, and performed the visible emotional architecture that every detained population across known space eventually produced. Anxiety, reassurance, fatigue, occasional flashes of anger. But in the maintenance recordings, grainier, poorly framed, made for equipment review rather than subject study, small pieces of the performance fell away. A woman in holding room 2 knelt beside the nutrition dispenser longer than necessary and pressed her fingertips along the service seam one by one. A broad-shouldered man in room 1 dropped a utensil, retrieved it, and in the motion touched the floor at 3 separate points near the door track. One of the older children in room 3 ran the edge of a sleeping mat between his fingers and then passed it to another child, who folded it twice and slid it beneath a bench as if checking compression resistance. Kel watched 6 hours of footage and found himself taking notes by hand because the official annotation software did not have categories for what he was looking at. Testing seam depth, checking floor flex, material assessment, transfer without verbal cue, observation under concealment of low-value camera. He stopped writing after that last one and stared at the page. Low-value camera. He had just assigned intent to them. That should have embarrassed him. It should have made him step back and reassert discipline, remind himself that detained colonists in a station-holding wing did not suddenly become covert operators because they touched a dispenser seam too thoughtfully. Instead he rewound the feed and watched the same 40 seconds again. The human woman at the dispenser was not searching randomly. She was checking fasteners. He spent the next hour moving through archived boarding scans of the Wayfarer's occupants and building a list of trades from the manifest. Propulsion technician, agricultural planner, structural welder, school instructor, atmospheric systems apprentice, long cycle medic, water reclamation specialist, municipal clerk. 3 adolescents marked only as general labor support. At first the list looked ordinary in the unimpressive way colony manifests usually did. Then he placed it side by side with the behaviors he had been recording. The welder was the one examining seams. The systems apprentice had spent 2 days near the vents. The school instructor asked structural and rotational questions under the cover of conversation. The municipal clerk had become the most active organizer of sleeping groups, food line order, and who sat where during the artificial evening dim. No one had announced leadership. No one had argued over authority. The work had simply arranged itself. Kel stood from his desk and paced the length of his quarters once before realizing he was doing the same thing as the older man in holding room 2, measuring without tools. On the 5th day he requested a second interview, this time with the oldest registered passenger from the Wayfarer. His name was Ivo Sarin, 68 standard years, former municipal planner, partial hearing loss in the left ear, chronic joint degeneration in both hands. The manifest described him as advisory passenger, non-essential to primary colonial labor structure. He entered the interview room using the table edge for support and sat with visible discomfort. If Kel had encountered him on a civic tram or in a records queue, he would have remembered him only as one more aging body carrying too much mileage. "Do you understand why you're here?" Kel asked. Ivo gave the translation terminal a brief glance and then looked directly at Kel. "Because you asked." The answer was so cleanly unhelpful that Kel almost admired it. He moved through standard prompts. Colony purpose, route planning, expected landfall procedure, agricultural dependencies, civic structure. Ivo answered all of them in the same mild tone, never resisting, never elaborating, never pretending confusion he did not need. Twice he paused to flex one hand under the table, And once he closed his eyes as if writing out a line of pain somewhere inside the joints. Near the end of the interview, Kel asked, "How are the detainees adapting to confinement?" Ivo's mouth shifted slightly. Not a smile. Something with the shape of one but none of its softness. "We've all lived in structures before," he said. That could have meant anything. Kel should have moved on. Instead he heard himself ask, "And before this one?" "Different structures," Ivo said. The old man's gaze dropped, just briefly, to Kel's hands. Kel became aware all at once that he had arranged his notes into room sectors without meaning to. Door side. Vent side. Blind corner. Sanitation wall. He closed the pad. The interview ended 3 minutes later. Ivo rose slowly, bracing against the chair, and before the guards escorted him out he asked, in a tone so neutral it was almost polite, "Do your night cycle technicians always service the upper corridor in pairs?" Kel said nothing. Ivo inclined his head as if the silence had been sufficient and left the room. Kel remained there long after the door shut. By station midnight he had the answer. The technicians did service the corridor in pairs. The pattern alternated every third cycle because one of the vents in the upper return line had been unstable for months. That information was not classified. It was also not available to detainees. Unless those detainees had been building the station from fragments of routine, gesture, timing, and overheard sound since the first hour of confinement. He went back through the recordings from day one. That was where the real damage happened. Because once he knew what he was looking for, the beginning was unmistakable. The first hour after intake, while some of the humans were still being assigned to rooms and others were still pretending shock strongly enough to satisfy the guards, a child in holding room 3 had already started counting the interval between patrol passes by tapping her thumb against her wrist. In room 2, before the second meal had been distributed, the welder had already tested the lower door seam while crouching as if to tie a boot fastening. In room 1, before first rest cycle, Ivo Sarin had already changed seats twice, each time giving himself a new angle on the ceiling vent, camera bubble, and light spacing. They had not begun planning after understanding the room. They had begun planning while learning it. Kel opened his private file again, but the sentence came before he sat down. He spoke it aloud to the empty quarters first, as if hearing it in air might make it less absurd. They started on arrival. Then he sat and wrote for nearly 2 hours without stopping. No trigger event precedes organization. No visible panic threshold initiates cooperation. No central command signal required. They do not wait to confirm danger before distributing tasks. They enter uncertainty already dividing labor. They assume confinement is temporary if studied correctly. They assume structure can be learned. They assume routine can be exploited. Most important, they begin before sufficient information exists. He stopped there only because the last line had unsettled him enough to still his hand. Before sufficient information exists. That was the difference, perhaps. Not intelligence. Not courage. Plenty of species possessed one or both in acceptable amounts. This was something more operational and therefore harder to dismiss. The humans did not appear to believe that planning required permission from reality to begin. By the time the door closed, they were already late to their own standards. Kel read the page back once, then saved it under the private file instead of the official case log. He told himself he needed one more day of evidence before escalating. The truth was simpler and more shameful. He already had enough evidence. What he lacked was any confidence that the people above him would understand what kind of danger it represented. On the 6th day, Kel Ren submitted his formal assessment to the Contact and Containment Bureau. It was 32 pages long, precise in structure, sober in language, and wrong in all the ways the Bureau most rewarded. He began with metallurgy because metallurgy was safe. Iron alloy hull construction. Low-yield chemical drive architecture. Visible fabrication marks inconsistent with advanced industrial standardization. Then life support redundancy, nutritional reserves, medtech limitations, agricultural cargo balance, civilian demographic spread. All the things an orderly institution liked to see laid flat under clean headings. Facts first. Interpretations only when tethered tightly enough to look respectable. The behavioral section took the most time because that was where the truth kept trying to leak in. He wrote that the detainees demonstrated high social cohesion under stress, that the juveniles showed above-average cooperative play adaptation, that the adults redistributed informal authority efficiently without overt challenge behavior, that interview subjects displayed unusual curiosity towards station routine and staffing structures. All true. None sufficient. He stopped over the threat classification field for almost a full minute before entering the line the Bureau expected from someone in his chair. Emergent colonial species. Limited near-term strategic projection. No evidence of coordinated military capability beyond local defensive improvisation. The word improvisation sat on the screen like a lie he had dressed for dinner. He could have written planning. He could have written immediate distributed problem-solving under confinement. He could have written organized intelligence gathering concealed inside social behavior. Instead, he wrote improvisation because improvisation was survivable language inside the Bureau. Improvisation meant primitive cleverness. Improvisation meant nothing that required doctrine-level reconsideration. Improvisation would be read, nodded at, and filed where it could do no damage to careers more senior than his own. When he transmitted the assessment upchain, the response came back in just under 43 minutes. Reviewed. Classification concurred. Proceed under standard release and return protocol. Human vessel to be provisioned and redirected within 60-day detention window. No escalation required. Kell read the approval twice. Then a third time, slower, as if somewhere inside the bureaucratic varnish there might be a hidden acknowledgement of what he had not quite dared to say outright. There was none. He closed the message and sat very still. Outside his quarters, station life moved with the perfect ordinary hum of a system confident in its categories. Maintenance drones in the upper ducts. Shift change chatter from the security ring. Cargo elevators cycling at reduced night volume. Somewhere a food service cart rattled over a floor seam that engineering had meant to fix for months and never considered urgent enough to prioritize. The station sounded exactly like a place that believed it knew what was inside it. Kell stood and returned to holding room 3. The children were not playing now. It was rest cycle dim, lights low enough to soften the edges of the room without giving privacy. Most of the detainees were lying down. A few adults sat with backs to the wall, apparently exhausted, apparently quiet. Mara Ilian was awake. She sat in the same position as always, one knee raised, one arm draped loosely across it, face turned toward the room rather than the glass. For a moment Kell thought that was progress, or at least relief. Then he realized she was not looking at the room. She was listening to it. The small sounds, breathing rhythms, shifts in sleeping mats. The hydraulic sigh in the corridor beyond the sealed door. The tiny click that came 3 seconds before the ceiling camera made its automated sweep. He knew the click. He had stopped hearing it years ago. Mara had not. As if to punish him for the thought, her gaze drifted upward exactly 1 beat before the camera rotated. Kell stepped back from the wall. He did not go to his quarters after that. He went to the Comanalysis Annex and pulled access on the Wayfarer's distress beacon logs. The original transmission had gone out at the moment of capture, just as the manifest said it would. Standard broad-spectrum emergency architecture. Narrowband relay hoping. Civilian encryption. Nothing remotely threatening. The Bureau's internal estimate had placed any response beyond human-controlled space at 14 months minimum. Chemical drive species did not rescue their way across interstellar distance in useful time. That was one of the comforting equations beneath the whole operation. Kell checked the outgoing packet timing anyway. Then he checked it again. The distress beacon had not been their only transmission. There had been a secondary burst, tiny enough to hide in the noise floor of the ship's own system's telemetry, routed through a maintenance channel not intended for long-range communication at all. It piggybacked on environmental diagnostics, rode out with thermal drift data, and vanished into background static so elegantly that the station's automated filters had never flagged it because they had never been told to imagine that a species with crude ships might think to hide a message inside its own breathing machinery. Kell isolated the burst and handed it to the translation matrix. The matrix returned nothing meaningful. Too compressed. too context-dependent, possibly corrupted, possibly machine shorthand. Which meant only one thing now. The humans had sent more than a distress call. His hands were suddenly cold. He rechecked chain of custody on the packet. No one had reviewed it. No one had even seen it. The station had caught the wayfarer, opened it, sorted its people into rooms, and gone on believing that time itself was on the Bureau's side. Kel stared at the silent line of metadata and understood, with a clarity so sharp it bordered on physical pain, that the first human countermeasure might already be traveling home while the station's command staff debated meal supplements and release schedules. He should have escalated then. Instead, he copied the packet into his private file. The act shamed him even while he did it. But shame was not enough to stop him, because by now the private file had ceased to be a convenience and become something closer to a raft. The official system was for stable truths. This other thing he was building was for the facts that felt unstable in his hands, the ones that changed shape the longer he looked at them. That night he added a new entry. Official underestimation is now part of the environment the humans are operating inside. This may be useful to them. I do not know whether they expected it. I suspect they did. He stopped there, then added one final line before saving. If they sense something hidden on day one, then our detention window is not a pause in events. It is merely the amount of time they have been granted to continue working before anyone here admits the work exists. When he returned to the observation gallery near dawn cycle, the adults in holding room 3 were serving breakfast portions to the children in a pattern that looked, at first glance, perfectly ordinary, until he noticed that the bowls changed hands in the same sequence every time. Repeat. He watched it happen 12 times before he understood that even the meal distribution had become a way of moving information without appearing to move anything at all. Below him, the humans carried on with the calm, low-effort rhythm of detainees learning to endure. Above them, Kel Ren stood behind one-way glass with a Bureau-approved report in the system and a hidden transmission in his private file and the growing certainty that everyone in command had just made a mistake so expensive the station had not yet developed the language to invoice it. The wayfarer was released on day 60 exactly, because institutions that have already made the wrong decision often become very precise about carrying it out cleanly. Kel Ren watched the ship leave from observation spine C, hands folded behind his back, expression arranged into the mild professional neutrality expected of Bureau personnel witnessing the conclusion of a standard detention and redirection procedure. Below him, docking cradle 12 disengaged in slow mechanical stages. The clamps withdrew. The service umbilicals peeled away. Small maneuvering bursts from the wayfarer's chemical thrusters nudged the crude iron hull free of the cradle, and for one brief absurd moment the vessel looked even smaller than it had on arrival, as if confinement had somehow diminished it physically as well as politically. The letters on the hull were still visible. SCV Wayfarer. Blocky, hand-painted, inelegant. The ship pivoted, engines flared, and it began the long outward burn assigned by station traffic control. No ceremony. No compensation discussion. No diplomatic escort. Just a detained colonial vessel turned around and sent back toward the edge of civilized space with a formal notice attached explaining territorial restrictions in language the Contact Bureau considered perfectly reasonable. Kel watched until the ship was nothing more than a bright point against the dark. Then he went back to his quarters, opened the private file, and added a single line. I do not believe they were ever going home in the way we meant. He left the sentence there because he could not yet support it with anything but instinct, and instinct had no standing in the Bureau's evidentiary culture. The war vote happened 11 days later. Kel did not attend. He was not military and not important enough to witness the conclave directly. But he saw the decision in the classified summaries routed through the analysis chain, and even the summary language had the careful bloodlessness of people trying not to name what they were doing too accurately. Territorial Enforcement Operation authorized. 43 naval hulls assigned. Objectives: demonstrate boundary control, neutralize unauthorized colonial expansion sites, compel compliance, establish revised contact hierarchy. No one used the word war. That alone would have told Kel enough, even if the rest of the summary had not. The conclave did not avoid words because it was honest. It avoided them because certain words changed the emotional weather inside a population, and this operation was not supposed to change anything except the humans' understanding of their place. Chemical drive species did not receive wars. They received correction. Kel read the summary twice, then requested transfer to campaign analysis under the completely truthful justification that he had been principal behavioral assessor on the human case and therefore represented the best available in-house continuity on species evaluation. The request was granted 2 days later, not because anyone valued his caution, but because no one else particularly wanted the file. That was how he found himself in Analysis Vault 3 on Ve Oren, 2 systems core ward from the border, watching the first engagements arrive as compressed battlefield packets across a wall of tactical displays. At first, everything worked. That was the worst part about bad assumptions. When reality contains enough complexity, a wrong model can appear to succeed for quite some time before it reaches the cost of its own simplicity. Human outer settlements buckled quickly under direct fleet pressure. Orbital defenses around the first colony world failed in under 7 hours. 3 convoy lanes were cut by the end of the first week. Human ships fought hard at close range but lacked the shield depth and drive authority to contest Ve doctrine in open space engagements. Ground resistance on the second world was irregular, localized, and bloodier than projected, but still within tolerances acceptable to military command. The campaign graphs all tilted in the correct direction. Territory gained. Human logistics reduced. Acceptable casualty expenditure. Strategic tempo maintained. Kel read the first month's reports with the numb, suspended focus of a man waiting for his own dread to be disproven by ordinary facts. For a while it nearly was. Then the little changes began. Not in the public summaries. Those remained clean and confident. In the secondary data. A strike team clearing an agricultural depot on the colony-designated Harrow Field noted that the defensive fire this week came from deeper angles than the same class of installation had used 10 days earlier, suggesting the humans had already reworked trench geometry after observing Ve advance lines. A naval report from the belt of Nara mentioned that human escort craft, though still tactically inferior, had begun dumping heat in deliberately misleading patterns before retreat, enough to distort standard pursuit solutions and pull 2 Ve cutters out of position. A casualty review from Ground Front Delta observed that the latest human militia formations were rotating wounded personnel out faster than before despite operating under worse supply conditions, implying a doctrinal correction had been distributed across units that had no obvious reason to share local lessons that quickly. None of it was dramatic alone. Together, it made Kel sit straighter in his chair. He opened a parallel comparison and laid the first 6 weeks side by side by engagement type rather than by campaign chronology. Colony defense against armored descent. Settlement perimeter action. Convoy ambush. Orbital retreat behavior. Fixed position withdrawal. The pattern emerged on the third pass. The humans were not simply resisting. They were editing. Each repeated engagement class showed a tiny improvement over the previous iteration, as if every contact with Ve doctrine had produced not only losses, but instruction. A weaker species should have become less coherent under campaign pressure. These people were becoming more specific. He ran the numbers again, stripping out terrain variation, weather distortion, local command quality, and material scarcity. The signal survived all of it. He carried the tablet across the vault to senior analyst Theron Isles, who was currently annotating fleet losses with the bored efficiency of a man whose career had been built on enemies staying categorizable. "Look at the slope," Kel said. Theron took the tablet without enthusiasm, scanned the first pane, then the second. "You're overfitting." "I thought so too." "Run it by engagement class." Theron did. His expression shifted, but only slightly. "Cornered populations adapt." "They're not adapting in the general sense," Kel said. "They are identifying specific failure points and removing them between contacts." Theron handed the tablet back. "Then we should be pleased they're learning the wrong lessons too late." Kel almost answered immediately. Instead he heard, in memory, the children in holding room 3 reducing signal size between rounds while appearing to play the same game. "Too late for what?" he nearly asked. Instead he said, "I think they are learning us." Theron gave him a look usually reserved for junior staff who had mistaken pattern recognition for prophecy. "They should," he said. "We're the ones winning." That was the official truth. Kel returned to his station and began a new private subfile under the old one. Not because the first file had been wrong. Because it had not been large enough. He titled this one campaign Observations and wrote for almost an hour before stopping. Humans are not fighting each battle as an isolated event. They are treating contact itself as data acquisition. Losses do not appear to discourage learning rate. In some cases, losses may be accelerating it. The critical question is no longer whether their technology is inferior. It is. The critical question is how quickly inferiority becomes modified by repeated observation. He paused, then added the sentence that had been forming since the first week of reports. If their species-level habit is to begin planning before sufficient information exists, then war may not degrade them the way it degrades us. War may clarify them. He stared at that line for a long time after writing it. Outside the vault, the campaign continued in the clean language of gains and compliance. Inside it, on screens no one reviewed with enough care, the humans were becoming more expensive. Not by much yet. Not enough to move the conclave. But enough for a man who had once watched children turn hiding into instruction to recognize the shape of the thing. The operation was succeeding. And somewhere inside that success, something worse than defeat had begun to grow. By the 4th month of the campaign, the VE command structure had begun developing a new tone in its internal memoranda. The words were still confident. That was part of the problem. Strategic pressure remains favorable. Human outer position resistance continues to degrade under sustained interdiction. Enemy local successes do not alter the overall campaign trajectory. The language held. The timing inside it did not. Meetings that had once taken 20 minutes were now scheduled for an hour and spilled past 2. Route corrections that should have been approved by District Command alone climbed 2 and 3 levels upward because no one wanted to be the officer who had failed to account for the possibility that the human movement in Sector Grey was not the real human movement in Sector Grey but the shadow of another movement intended to draw VE attention away from a third movement no one had yet identified. Kel Ren watched this change happen through metadata before he saw it acknowledged anywhere official. Approval windows widened. Revisions multiplied. Orders were amended closer to execution time. Analytical requests from Field Command grew less about force concentration and more about interpretation. Does this convoy route appear genuine? Estimate probability that current signal pattern is planted. Assess whether repeated retreat behavior in Delta 6 represents collapse or shaping action. Determine likelihood that abandoned depot in Harrow Belt was intentionally provisioned for capture. The last one made Kel sit back in his chair. He opened the attached field report. A VE strike company had overrun a human supply post after a clean flanking movement supported by orbital scan confirmation. The defenders broke at predictable casualty thresholds. The position fell intact. Food stores remained. Munitions remained. Medical packs remained. It looked, in the first hour, like one of the tedious seizures of the month. Then quartermasters began inventory. The crates closest to the access route were all there and full. The crates one layer deeper were there and empty. The power cells left behind were real but incompatible with captured launcher systems. The visible medical supplies were intact, while the broad-spectrum antibiotics and trauma coagulants had been removed so completely that the shelving still showed the clean rectangular shadows where the cases had been stored until very shortly before the strike. The report's final line, written by a logistics officer who had clearly not wanted to sound emotional in an official document, read, "Position appears to have been arranged to satisfy enemy expectations of supply capture while withholding critical utility." Kel copied that sentence into his private file. That afternoon, a second report arrived from a fleet commander operating near the Nara crossings. The commander had committed 2 pursuit cutters to what looked like a standard human retreat pattern: damaged escorts, uneven drive signature, intermittent comm chatter, visible heat bleed suggesting poor containment. Everything about the contact said panic. The cutters closed aggressively. The human ships were not panicking. They were laying a trail. Not mines. Not decoys in the material sense. Misreadable evidence. Their heat dumps, comm fragments, and engine stutters had all been calibrated to suggest exactly one thing: a damaged retreating formation with poor coordination and one failing reactor. By the time the Vey cutters realized they had been drawn out of the patrol envelope, the actual human strike package, silent, cold, and vectoring from an entirely different angle, had already crossed behind them and burned through the fuel tenders they were supposed to be screening. Kel read the after-action packet twice, then walked it personally to Commander Analyst Theron Isles. Theron took the slate, scanned it, and said, "They got lucky." Kel did not answer immediately. Theron looked up. "What?" "They did not get lucky," Kel said. "They got believed." Theron's face hardened almost imperceptibly. "You've been saying versions of that for months." "Yes. And the campaign still advances." Kel looked at the wall display behind Theron's desk, where the campaign map still showed broad Vey territorial control in the human outer colonies. It was true. The fronts had not collapsed. The numbers still favored Vey command in any static reading. But static readings were becoming their own kind of blindness. "They are not trying to stop us from moving," Kel said quietly. "They are trying to decide how we move." Theron's silence lasted long enough to count as discomfort. Then he handed back the slate. "Submit it through channels if you think it matters that much." Kel returned to his desk and did exactly that. This time he did not argue for reclassification. He argued for vocabulary. He built the report around a term the translation matrix could only partially resolve from the newest batch of intercepted human planning documents. Psychological operations. At first the phrase had seemed too broad to be useful. But the more he worked through the human material, the more horrifyingly precise it became. This was not merely intimidation. Not just propaganda. Not battlefield morale in the ordinary sense. It was a formalized strategic discipline aimed at shaping what the enemy thought was happening, what the enemy feared might happen, and how quickly uncertainty would spread through enemy decision systems once confidence had been punctured. The humans did not treat fear as a side effect. They treated it as terrain. Kel's report included 5 examples from the last 6 weeks: false withdrawal signatures, bait depots, staged communications leaks, timed attacks launched after documented Vey supply exhaustion windows, and one especially ugly operation in which a human unit repeatedly broadcast contradictory retreat codes over channels known to be monitored, causing 2 neighboring Vey commands to commit reserves in opposite directions and then distrust one another's reporting for 9 days afterward. He ended the report with the only honest sentence he could produce. Evidence suggests human command is conducting a parallel campaign aimed not at defeating Vey forces in direct material terms, but at degrading confidence inside Vey interpretation structures. In human doctrine, uncertainty appears not to be collateral. It appears to be a weapon objective. The response arrived 4 hours later. Filed. Observed destabilization attempts are consistent with expected behavior from pressured adversaries. No doctrinal adjustment recommended at this stage. Kel stared at the message until the characters began losing shape. Not because the response was surprising, because it was so carefully ordinary. He saved it to the private file and kept working. 2 days later, Admiral Sarek Vov of the 3rd Expansion Line triggered a fleet redeployment based on intercepted human traffic indicating an impending major counteroffensive against the Talon corridor. The signs were overwhelming. Supply movement, coded urgency markers, command chatter, encrypted bursts between 3 frontier groups. Enough to justify concentration under any sane reading. The corridor remained untouched. While Admiral Vov stacked force against the expected blow, human strikes hit 3 secondary logistics branches and 1 communications array behind his flank. None were individually catastrophic. Together they cut his operational pace almost in half and forced emergency rationing across a front that had been stable for 7 weeks. Kel received the fleet review packet before dawn cycle. He opened it and found, attached at the end, a transcript of a recovered human message fragment translated only partially into Vey standard. Optimal pressure window projected at 40 to 60 hours post-redeployment. Maintain ambiguity. Enemy confidence decay remains favorable. He read the line again. Pressure window. Confidence decay. Not poetry. Not improvisation. Metrics. He stood up so quickly his chair struck the workstation behind him. For a moment he simply paced the length of his office, the same short line over and over, thinking of the children in holding room 3 and their game that was not a game, of old Ivo Sarin measuring a room while pretending to be tired, of Tomas Vale embedding structural questions in harmless conversation, of Mara Ilian listening to the rhythm of cameras and doors. The humans had not invented this war at the front. They had arrived already knowing what kind of species they were inside pressure. That evening Kel opened the private file and wrote without stopping for nearly an hour. We keep describing their behavior as reactive because we assume intelligence follows contact. This assumption is wrong. They are entering every exchange with pre-existing frameworks for deception, stress use, and enemy shaping. Their battlefield conduct implies established doctrine around ambiguity, morale timing, and interpretive overload. This is not a desperate species becoming cunning under pressure. It is a practice species applying normal tools to a new opponent. He sat back, flexed his aching fingers, then added the sentence he knew he would not yet dare to send through official channels. I believe we have mistaken a civilization at the beginning of spaceflight for a civilization at the beginning of war. The notebooks reached Kel Ren in a crate of things no one else wanted. That was how the most important evidence of the war so far entered his office. Not under seal, not with command urgency, not even with a proper classification ribbon. Just a salvage container from ground front Sealand containing 15 kilograms of paper artifacts, 3 broken personal devices, a bent mess tin, 2 chemical heating tabs, and a note from field recovery stating, captured from abandoned human command dugout. Possible cultural material. Route to archives if useful. Paper. Kel stared at that word in the manifest for several seconds before opening the crate. Most spacefaring species used paper only ceremonially, if at all. Paper burned, tore, absorbed moisture, and refused indexing discipline. It was the sort of medium a civilization outgrew once it had anything better. Yet here it was, stacked in worn bundles bound by cloth ties and pressure clips, every cover marked by human handwriting in dense, slanted script. He picked up the top one carefully. The cover was soft from handling. The edges had gone dark with oil from fingers. Several pages near the back were warped as if they had once been damp and then dried inside a pocket or under a body for too long. This was not archive paper. It was working paper. Carried, opened, folded, returned to. The translation matrix took 37 seconds to resolve the cover. 3rd Mobile Engineering Regiment Action Review Log Cycle Set 11. Action Review. Kel sat down slowly. The first pages were not letters. Not morale pieces. Not personal reflections in the way a culture under pressure might preserve sentiment to protect itself from attrition. They were structured records. Engagement date. Location grid. Mission objective. Observed enemy response. Equipment failure points. Unexpected environmental factors. What worked? What failed? What should change immediately? What should be taught before the next contact? Every entry ended with a signature. Every entry was dated. Every entry had marginal additions in different hands, meaning later readers had come back to argue, refine, or confirm. Kel read the first notebook for 2 hours without noticing the station lights change to evening cycle around him. The humans did not write about combat the way VE officers wrote about combat. VE reports were linear. Unit moved. Position met. Resistance encountered. Objective taken or not taken. Casualties attached. Sometimes there was reflection, but reflection was usually retrospective and mostly attached to preserving accountability. The human logs were different. They treated each engagement as unfinished until it had yielded extraction value. One entry described a failed defense of a ridgeline on a colony world Kel knew they had lost in the 2nd month. The human commander did not spend a sentence on heroism. Not one on grief. Instead, enemy shielded advance elements overcommit to comm node neutralization once relay burst identified. This creates a repeatable timing hole in their right sweep if relay signatures are allowed to live 3 to 5 seconds longer than doctrinally comfortable. Recommend future teams build false relay persistence into withdrawal scripts. Kel turned the page. Another entry. New World. New commander. Same format. Tried false relay persistence per set 11 recommendation. Worked partially. Enemy delayed right sweep by 4.2 seconds. Not enough for team extraction but enough to confirm pattern. Need decoy package stronger in thermal profile. He stopped reading and looked at the opposite wall of his office. Set 11 recommendation. Not inspiration. Not brilliance in the moment. Transfer. He opened the next notebook. Different unit. Different theater. Different terrain entirely. Yet in the margin of the 5th page the same reference appeared again, translated by the matrix into rough VE standard. See Engineering Set 11, page 34. Their communications kill priority stays higher than support kill priority under confusion conditions. Use it. Kel's throat tightened. The knowledge was moving. Not through legendary commanders. Not through genius officers whose singular minds bent battle around themselves. Through records. Portable, worn, ugly, ordinary records. He summoned all remaining notebooks from the crate and laid them across his desk in expanding rows. Action review. Field revision. Lessons transfer. Casualty adaptation. Signal exploitation. Medical triage update. Civilian movement concealment. Junior officer notes. Training corrections. Training corrections. That one was the smallest notebook in the crate. The cover had been patched twice. Inside, in compressed handwriting, were brief lessons extracted from previous engagements and rewritten for rapid use in drills. If enemy targets comms first, then never let real comms look most important. If position likely to fall, pre-stage absence before staging defense. If captured supplies unavoidable, decide what they are supposed to think they captured. If new commander arrives, make them read last 3 review sets before giving them a map. Kel read that last line twice. Then a third time. If new commander arrives, make them read last 3 review sets before giving them a map. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. That was it. That was the mechanism. The humans were rotating commanders without losing continuity because continuity was not stored in the commander. It was stored in the records. In notebooks. In logs. In written review sets passed from hand to hand. The commander did not have to be irreplaceable if the learning system was. Which meant you could kill a human unit leader and still inherit all the decisions that leader had already made into the next one. You could scatter a formation and the formation would still keep its memory if enough paper survived. You could disrupt personalities, habits, hierarchies, egos, and none of it would matter as much because the actual instrument of improvement lived outside the individual. Kel opened his private file and did not bother with cautious phrasing this time. The VE command assumption that experience resides primarily in the surviving leader is false when applied to humans. Their operational memory is externalized. It is written. It is circulated. It is argued with and refined. It survives casualties. It survives reassignment. Possibly it survives defeat more efficiently than our own command memory survives victory. He stared at the line, then added another. You cannot meaningfully decapitate a species that keeps its brain in notebooks. A soft knock came at his office door. He almost ignored it, then remembered he still inhabited a bureaucracy and not his own head. Enter. Paris stepped in, carrying 2 data slates and the expression of someone who had learned over recent months to ask questions only after checking whether Kel was already in the middle of discovering something worse. You asked for the captured signal traffic from Sealand Front, Paris said, then stopped when he saw the desk. What is all this? Kel picked up the smallest notebook and held it out. Paris took it with visible caution. He read one page, then another. His eyes moved faster. These are the lessons. Yes. From active units? Yes. Circulated after engagements? Yes. Paris looked up slowly. Why would they do this on paper? Kel almost answered because they are primitive, but the sentence died before it reached his mouth. Instead he said, because paper does not require infrastructure. Because paper cannot be hacked from orbit. Because paper survives power loss and signal collapse and retreat and mud and blood and cold if someone keeps carrying it. Paris went very still. On the desk between them, the notebooks waited in their ugly human ordinariness, soft-covered and worn, full of a civilization's refusal to let a mistake remain private once it had been paid for. Kel took the slate from Paris's other hand without looking at it. "What's this?" "Casualty correlation from the last 4 months," Paris said, still staring at the notebook. "Our losses are up again." Kel nodded once. Of course they were. The humans were still behind in ships. Still behind in shields. Still behind in reach. But now Kel understood the deeper imbalance more clearly than ever. The Vey were fighting this war with armies. The humans were fighting it with memory. The archive reached Kel Ren in fragments first, which somehow made it worse. If it had arrived all at once, announced by a breach team with military panic in their voices and threat flags bright enough to trigger half the conclave, he might have approached it defensively, as one approaches an explosion from behind glass. But the material came piecemeal through analysis channels that did not yet understand what they had stolen. A compressed doctrinal index here. A partial translation set there. A logic tree note from the Network Intrusion Division saying only, recovered cultural historical files exceed expected scale. Relevance uncertain. Routing to species analysis. Uncertain. Kel opened the first package at 9:14 and did not leave his desk again until long after the station lights dimmed. The human network the Vey breach team had penetrated was not, as Command had expected, primarily civilian infrastructure with a few military partitions buried inside it. It was a civilization that had spent an absurd amount of effort preserving itself in writing. Archives nested inside archives. Mirrors of mirrors. Public files, restricted files, teaching files, declassified files, historical reconstructions, argument threads attached to source texts centuries old. The network had not yielded one military library. It had yielded strata. Kel began with what the breach summary labeled comparative conflict history. He expected, perhaps, a dozen entries. 20, if the humans were especially politically unstable by Class II standards. The table did not end where it should have ended. He scrolled once, twice, then changed to total count view and sat perfectly still as the translation matrix resolved the number into Vey standard. 413 major conflicts with documentary support. Substate conflicts uncounted in this layer. Civil wars broken out separately. Insurgencies catalogued by region and duration. Pre-industrial campaigns preserved in reconstructed form from fragmentary records. Kel read the number again. Then a third time. The Vey had 5 wars in all remembered history. 5, spread across so many centuries that war itself had always felt to Kel like a rare atmospheric event. Destructive when it came, yes, but infrequent enough that civilization could build itself on the assumption that peace was the normal state of intelligent life. The humans had fought more wars than the Vey had serious droughts. He opened the casualty tables next and immediately wished he had not. The data was messy in the older eras, as all old data was messy. But even conservative estimates produced totals so large that the matrix kept checking the formatting for misplaced decimal markers. 1 century alone contained death counts beyond the sum of all Vey war dead since the invention of metal flight. Not one age of darkness buried in prehistory. Not one aberration. Repeatedly. Across different centuries. Different technologies. Different political systems. Different names for the same behavior. Kel pushed back from the desk and stood because the body sometimes needed to change shape when the mind failed. He walked once to the office window and saw only his own reflection in the dark panel. Not helpful. He came back, sat down, and opened the oldest strategic text the breach team had translated cleanly enough to index. It was 2,500 years old. He knew that because the file had 3 separate dating systems attached to it: original human calendar, later standardized planetary calendar, and comparative galactic chronology added by the breach team for convenience. The thing was so old that Vey tactical literature from the same era amounted to agricultural feud songs and fragmentary oral recollections about river crossings. The human text was a manual. Not ceremonial. Not mythic. Practical. It discussed deception as if deception were not dishonorable improvisation but one of the central instruments of conflict. It discussed terrain, false appearances, timing, morale, information asymmetry, The value of making an enemy spend strength in the wrong place. Kel did not read it so much as feel it closing around the last 18 months of war. He had seen these ideas already. In the false convoy routes. In the empty target corridors. In the bait depots. In the humans' habit of making vague commanders look exactly where the real blow would not land. He cross-referenced the text against his campaign file. Matches bloomed across the screen. The old book described the war the Vey were losing right now with unnerving precision, and it had been written before the humans had electricity, let alone spaceflight. Kel picked up another file. Then another. A theorist from 200 years before human orbital expansion whose work centered on friction, uncertainty, and the difference between war on paper and war as lived experience. A strategist from an air combat era who argued that victory belonged not to the side with the cleanest doctrine but to the side that could move through observation, decision, and action faster than the enemy could update its picture of reality. A cluster of military psychology documents so vast and clinically detailed that Kel at first misclassified them as medical sociology. They were not sociology. They were a science of what repeated violence did to the mind and how to preserve function inside it. He sat with that for a long time. The Vey had no equivalent field because the Vey had never accumulated enough war over enough generations to force the question into permanence. They had trauma care, certainly. They had individual treatment categories for shock and grief and combat stress responses. But the humans had built a whole discipline around the inner damage of war because they had enough of it, continuously, through enough centuries, to require doctrine not only for winning battles but for carrying home the survivors in a form that could fight, teach, and govern again. It was not just that they fought often. It was that they had made conflict legible to themselves at every scale. Strategic, operational, psychological, institutional, personal, and they had written it all down. Kel called Paris into the office after midnight. Paris arrived with the wary expression of a subordinate who had learned that being summoned at odd hours usually meant the world had shifted again, and Kel wished to name the direction of the shift before command did. Kel said nothing at first. He simply turned the display toward him. Paris read. Stopped. Scroll back. Read again. That number is wrong, he said finally. It is not. This many wars. Yes. Paris looked at the casualty table and then at the old strategic text, which Kel had left open beside it with several translated lines marked. The young analyst's face lost color slowly rather than all at once. They kept these. Yes. They teach these. Yes. Paris swallowed. We thought they were young. Kel considered that. They are young in space, he said. They are not young where this is concerned. Paris did not answer. He did not need to. The last remaining illusion in the room had just collapsed between them. Kel opened a new document, official this time, not private. He placed it under direct intelligence review and marked it for emergency doctrinal reconsideration. He did not build the case from instinct now. He built it from archive evidence, campaign cross-reference, and comparative conflict scale. He attached the casualty tables, the philosophical texts, the psychological operations material, the after-action notebook system, the proof of commander rotation without memory loss. He wrote for 3 hours and ended with the first sentence he had ever composed in official language that felt equal to the size of the thing it described. Humanity is not an emerging military civilization. Humanity is a mature conflict civilization newly arrived in space. He looked at that line for a long time before sending it. Then he added one more beneath it. We have mistaken technological youth for historical innocence. These are not the same thing. He transmitted the file at 3:11. At 3:19, before any response had arrived from the directorate, a new campaign alert flashed across the wall display. 31 human counteroffensives. 3 systems. 18 hours. All synchronized. Kel closed his eyes once. Not because he was surprised. Because now, at last, he understood that surprise itself had been the weapon, and that the archive on his desk was not the story of how humanity had become dangerous. It was the record of how long they had been practicing. The human counteroffensive did not feel, at first, like an attack. It felt like several unrelated errors happening at once. A relay chain went dark in the southern branch of the Hadron Corridor and stayed dark long enough for command to assume a localized technical failure rather than hostile action. Two convoy groups in the outer belt of Narral reported contradictory contact signatures and each diverted to support the other, arriving just late enough to discover that neither had needed support until after they had both moved. A fuel reserve station at Vask Minor transmitted a clean all clear on schedule, then failed to answer its next 3 check cycles because the humans had taken the station 17 minutes earlier and were already using its transmitters to shape the confusion spreading outward from it. Kel Ren watched the first 8 hours from Analysis Vault 3 with the peculiar stillness that sometimes follows the death of a question. He had stopped asking whether the Vey were underestimating humanity. That question had been answered too many times to be useful. Now the only questions that remained were scale and speed. How far had the humans prepared this? How many versions of this had they rehearsed? How much of the last 18 months had not been losing at all, but positioning? By the 12th hour the tactical map no longer resembled a front. It resembled a body discovering too late that several of its major nerves had already been cut. 31 human strikes had landed in 3 star systems against positions the Vey had taken, fortified, and normalized over the previous 4 months. None of the targets were symbolically important. That was one of the worst parts. The humans were not aiming for what would look dramatic on a public map. They were aiming for what held the map together in the unseen places. Fuel transfer stations, routing hubs, mid-tier command depots, munitions caches just far enough back from the line that field commanders thought of them as stable facts rather than vulnerable assets. Clausewitz, Kel thought with a kind of exhausted clarity. Centers of gravity. Not everything. Just the thing that lets everything else keep standing. He opened the running loss grid and began marking the struck positions against his long private graph of rising Vey engagement cost. One by one the names aligned with the highest sections of the slope. The humans had not merely learned where the Vey were. They had learned which Vey holdings had cost the most attention, the most fuel, the most reinforcement, the most friction to maintain. They had let the Vey work hardest to hold certain gains and then, when those gains had become structurally load-bearing, they had returned to collect them. 18 months, Kel thought. 18 months of retreating in shapes that looked like weakness to a species that measured war in territory lines and fleet tonnage. The first emergency conclave session on the counteroffensive began at 6:20 station time and ran 9 hours without producing a plan anyone in the room believed would still be valid by the time it reached the front. Kel was not in the chamber, but he could feel the paralysis in the request traffic pouring down into the vaults. Confirm whether Southern Narral is a diversion. Assess likelihood that Hadron signal collapse precedes main thrust elsewhere. Estimate whether the Vask seizure is sustainable or sacrificial. Determine probable true objective of current enemy advance. That last request came in 3 times from 3 different command levels, phrased differently each time and meaning the same thing. What are they really doing? Kel answered none of them. Not because he lacked ideas. Because the question itself was becoming useless. There was no single hidden objective behind the visible objectives. That was the lesson the Vey still kept trying not to learn. The humans were not obscuring one true strike behind layers of false ones. They were attacking the Vey's confidence in interpretation itself. Every hour command spent trying to decide which movement mattered most was an hour the humans spent taking 3 more positions whose value would only become visible after they were gone. On the second day Admiral Sarikvov sent a message directly to Kel's office. No preamble. No formalities. Did we ever have a point at which stopping this war would have been cheaper than continuing it? Kel read the line twice. Then he answered with the honesty that had long ago ceased to be useful for his career and become useful only for accuracy. Several. The earliest was before we boarded the Wayfarer. The Admiral's reply came 7 minutes later. That is not actionable. Kel looked at the message for a while, then closed it without responding. By the 11th day the Vey had lost 4 systems. Not lost in the sense of total annihilation or fleet collapse. The Vey still possessed ships. Still held colonies and routes and heavy positions. But the shape of the war had turned. The briefings could no longer talk about continued favorable tempo because tempo itself now belonged to the humans. Every attempt to stabilize one front exposed another. Every reserve commitment arrived into a battle space the enemy had already changed. VE Field Command was still fighting, often well, but it was fighting inside frameworks the humans had already studied, revised against, and decided how to fatigue. The ceasefire offer arrived on a Tuesday. Kel remembered the day only because the first reaction in the vault was not relief. It was suspicion so immediate and unanimous that even the automated translation queue kicked the document into triple redundancy review before any analyst touched it. The offer was formal, complete, structured, reasonable. That last part moved through the vault like a chemical irritant. Reasonable terms from a species that was winning should not have felt dangerous. But after 2 years of war against humans, danger no longer wore the shapes the VE expected. Annihilation they understood. Humiliation they understood. Grand demands, territorial strip mining, permanent tribute structures, disarmament clauses designed to hollow out the loser's future, those all fit known patterns. This did not. Return of captured personnel and seized vessels. Recognition of human territorial boundaries. Creation of a clearly defined buffer zone between VE and human-settled space. Economic reparations for the detained colony mission that had triggered the conflict, calculated down to transport loss, infrastructure delay, biological cargo spoilage, and projected settlement cost. Not a symbolic number. A documented one. Kel sat in the secondary review chamber while legal analysts and diplomatic historians turned the pages over and over looking for the trap. They checked terminology in 6 parallel translations. They modeled compliance outcomes. They searched for hidden asymmetries in the wording. They found none. The terms were fair, which meant the terms had been written by a species entirely aware of how frightening fairness can be when it comes from someone who did not need to offer it. A senior conclave member finally said what half the room had been circling for hours. If they wanted to hurt us with this document, they could have. They chose not to. No one answered him, because the shape of that choice was the answer. The humans were not stopping because they had run out of force. They were stopping because the war had reached the point at which more damage would no longer purchase proportionate advantage. They had measured enough, learned enough, taken enough. And now they were offering terms that preserved VE dignity not out of mercy exactly, but out of control. Kel thought of the old word from pre-flight predator studies, the one he would one day place in the registry. Not peace. At the prisoner exchange station he saw the proof of it with his own eyes. The human ship that docked was military, compact and clean-lined, all function and discipline. Not the crude public awkwardness of the wayfarer. This was what humanity looked like when it was no longer pretending to be only a colony species. The exchanged prisoners crossed in ordered groups. The VE detainees looked tired, thinner, careful in their movements, but unharmed. The humans who returned looked worse physically and far better in a way Kel did not at first have language for. They looked as if captivity had been a field assignment. Measured, annotated internally. Then the exchange officer came forward to sign the final verification forms. Her uniform was dark, undecorated except for rank bars and a small unit insignia Kel did not recognize. Her name on the translated roster was Commander Lynn Vasquez. She reviewed the counts, signed cleanly, passed the slate back across the table, and then for a second longer than procedure required she looked directly at Kel. Not at random. At him. He felt the old sensation from the observation glass return in full. Being found in a place designed for watching. The commander tilted her head slightly. Archivist Wren? He had not introduced himself. Yes. You wrote the revised advisory attached to the ceasefire appendix. It was not a question. Kel said, I wrote part of it. She gave the smallest nod, as if a calculation had settled into place. Then she said, good records shorten wars. Nothing in the sentence was dramatic. No threat. No triumph. No visible accusation over the wayfarer, the detention, the months of blood that had followed. That made it worse. Because in that moment Kel understood what the ceasefire actually was. Not forgiveness. Not exhaustion. Not diplomacy in the VE sense. It was a final lesson delivered in the same spirit as the notebooks, the old strategy texts, the after-action reviews, the blood map, the children's game. This is what happened. This is what it cost. Write it down correctly. Do better next time. Commander Vasquez took her people and crossed back to the waiting ship. Kel stood in the docking bay long after the bridge had retracted, thinking about a species that had every practical ability to ask for more and had chosen not to, not because they were soft and not because they were new to power, but because restraint, too, had become part of their doctrine. When he returned to Vey Prime, he opened his private file to the last page and wrote only one line. The most dangerous thing about them may be that they know exactly how much force is enough. Kel Ren was given the registry assignment because no one else wanted the burden of describing humanity in public language. The internal reports were one thing. They could carry caveats, probabilities, redactions, the layered protections institutions used when they wished to admit danger without fully absorbing what the admission required. The Galactic Registry was different. The registry was where civilizations told the truth they intended other civilizations to build policy around. Once a classification entered the public record there, patrol routes changed. Border law changed. Trade exposure changed. Military academies rewrote lecture material. Species that had never met you adjusted the distance at which they intended to keep meeting you in the future. For 2 years, humanity's entry had read: Class 2 Emerging Civilization. Limited projection capacity. Early contact volatility low to moderate. Kel had to replace it. He spent the first day on numbers because numbers were stable enough to touch. Fleet losses on both sides. System control shifts across the 2-year conflict. Confirmed civilian casualties. Captured personnel returned under ceasefire terms. Economic reparations assessed and paid. Territorial boundaries recognized. Buffer zone codified. All of it lined up neatly when reduced to columns. The columns did not help him. The problem sat 1 page deeper than numbers, in the field the registry called Civilizational Assessment Index. 3 lines maxim. The official summary of what a species was when other species needed the answer quickly. Kel left the field blank for almost 9 hours. He thought about the Wayfarer in Docking Cradle 12, iron-hulled and laughably slow. He thought about the first word he had written, embarrassing, and felt no shame now, only a kind of clinical distance from the younger version of himself who had mistaken visible sophistication for the whole of civilization. He thought about the children in Holding Room 3 turning a game into instruction while appearing merely to cope. About Evo Sarin and the blood map, about Tomas Vale's questions hidden inside other questions, about Mara Ilian looking exactly where his face should have been and holding the place until he broke. He thought about notebooks worn soft with handling. About strategy texts older than some Vey cities. About 413 wars. About a species that had taken repeated catastrophic violence and turned it into literacy, doctrine, medicine, review systems, rotation logic, and institutions dedicated not simply to fighting, but to learning from fighting faster than the next enemy could keep pace. He thought, too, about the ceasefire. That remained the most difficult part to fit into words. If humanity had only been ruthless, the registry entry would have been easier. If they had demanded humiliation, tribute, occupation rights, permanent fleet disarmament, a rewritten Vey political structure. If they had behaved the way frightened officials had first searched the treaty for signs of behaving, Kel could have classified them within older patterns. Dangerous. Aggressive. Expansionist. Predatory in the simple sense. But that was not what they had done. They had stopped exactly where advantage no longer required more damage. They had documented the costs with unnerving precision. They had offered terms that were fair enough to disturb everyone who read them. The restraint mattered because it completed the picture. Not a berserk species. Not a chaotic one. Not merely hard to kill. A species that knew how much force it could apply and how much it had decided to withhold. That was what the old pre-flight predator word had always meant on Vey Prime. Not safety. Not mercy. Kel opened a new draft and wrote the phrase in Old Vey script first, just to see whether the shape of it still felt accurate. It did. The translation problem took the rest of the afternoon. No major diplomatic language carried the word cleanly because no major spacefaring civilization had needed it for a very long time. The nearest cognates all drifted toward peace, dormancy, disinterest, non-aggression. All wrong. The old VE term meant the interval in which the apex predator had become aware of you, understood perfectly what it could do, and for reasons belonging to itself had not yet acted. The safety in the word was entirely contingent. The intelligence in it was the point. Kel tested 14 translation structures. None of them were good enough until he stopped trying to reproduce the exact old word and instead translated the function of it into registry standard diplomatic language. He wrote, classification, sustained conflict civilization status, fully sapient, strategically mature, historically conditioned for adaptive warfare advisory, do not wake. He read it 3 times. The first line covered the scale. The second covered the mechanism. The third covered the truth. He submitted the report before he could lose nerve and rewrite it into something more bureaucratically cowardly. The responses began arriving 6 days later, not through formal debate, but through the quiet side movements of governments adjusting themselves around a danger they had no wish to discuss in public before the adjustment was complete. A patrol cluster from the Orthen Reach altered its route to give human buffer corridors an extra 12 million kilometers of courtesy distance. 2 trade consortia added new non-provocation clauses to deep space shipping contracts in sectors adjacent to human territories. A species on the inner arm, previously enthusiastic about exploratory contact exchanges with Earth, suddenly slowed its diplomatic tempo to what its ambassador described as deliberative pacing. 3 separate military academies requested access to the public portions of the war archive attached to the registry note. No one officially protested the classification. No one officially praised it either. They simply moved. That was how civilizations behaved when the truth was too large to argue with and too dangerous to announce as panic. On the 9th day after submission, Kel received a private message routed outside ordinary channels. The sender was a junior diplomat from the Urine Compact, a species Kel had never met and likely never would. The message contained 1 line. Is the advisory intended as warning or respect? Kel read it twice, then set the terminal down and looked out the office window into the evening haze over VE Prime. The answer came more easily than he expected. But they are the same thing. No reply followed. Months later, after the review board had formally cleared him and the Bureau had tried in its embarrassed institutional way to restore normality around him, Kel returned to his old office with the box of private files under one arm. 112 pages, then more after the ceasefire, then more after the registry. He set the box on the desk and stood there for a while without opening it. The regular work queue waited on his console. Trade corridor analysis. Emerging contact logistics. A border ecology dispute. Ordinary problems from an ordinary galaxy trying very hard to continue being ordinary. Kel opened a new official proposal instead. Title: Species of Sustained Conflict Capacity, Long-Term Study Initiative. Not to imitate humanity. That was impossible and, he thought, undesirable. But to understand what kind of species they were, what conditions had built them, what institutions had preserved them, what record-keeping habits had transformed survival into doctrine and doctrine into a civilizational reflex. Because now the VE lived next to that species. Now the galaxy did. He submitted the proposal, then finally opened the old box and took out the first page he had ever written on the Wayfarer case. Initial impression: technologically immature, materially crude, low-threat colonial architecture. He looked at the sentence for a long time. Then he turned the page over and wrote on the back, in small neat script meant for no audience but his own record. The mistake was not thinking they were young. The mistake was thinking young meant unmade. He placed the page back in the file, closed the box, and returned to work in a galaxy that had learned, quietly and all at once, the only rule that now mattered where humanity was concerned. Do not wake.